Stop waiting for tomorrow. Why small habits are stronger than talent. Motivational story. There was once a young man named Elias who believed, with complete certainty, that he simply had not found his moment yet. He watched people around him rise. A friend who launched a business, a classmate who became a respected artist, a stranger online who seemed to wake up one day successful, and he told himself the same story every time. They got lucky. They had talent I don't have. Their moment came, and mine hasn't yet. Elias was not lazy. He dreamed constantly, sketched plans in notebooks, imagined the life he wanted in vivid detail. But every time he sat down to actually begin, something in him whispered that today wasn't quite right. Tomorrow, when he had more time. Tomorrow, when he felt more ready. Tomorrow, when the conditions finally aligned. He did not know it yet, but tomorrow was the most expensive word in his vocabulary, and he had been spending it carelessly for years. This is a story about what changed for Elias, and more importantly, it is a story about a truth the world rarely tells you clearly. Small habits, repeated without glamour or applause, will always outlast talent that waits for the perfect moment to begin. If this story moves you even slightly, subscribe to this channel now, because what you are about to hear may be the exact thing you needed to hear today. Let's begin. The man who waited. Elias was 26 when he met his uncle Tobias again, after nearly a decade apart. Tobias had once been the family's quiet disappointment, a man who left a stable job in his 30s to pursue woodworking, a hobby everyone assumed would fade within a year. Instead, by the time Elias saw him again, Tobias owned a small workshop known throughout the region for furniture so precise and beautiful that people waited months for a single piece. Elias, half in admiration and half in envy, asked him the question that had haunted him for years. "How did you know you had the talent for this?" Tobias laughed, not unkindly, and said something Elias would never forget. "Talent had almost nothing to do with it. I just showed up to that workshop every single day, even on the days I made something ugly, even on the days I wanted to quit, even on the days nobody was watching and nothing seemed to be working." Elias did not understand yet. He assumed Tobias was being modest, the way successful people often are. Surely there was a turning point, a moment of discovery, some spark of natural ability that set things in motion. But Tobias insisted there wasn't one. There was only a decision, made quietly on an unremarkable Tuesday, to spend 30 minutes a day at a workbench, regardless of how he felt or what the result looked like. That decision, repeated for thousands of days, was the entire secret. There was no other secret hiding behind it. Elias left that conversation unsettled, because some part of him understood that this answer was both simpler and harder than anything he wanted to hear. The myth of the big leap. For most of his life, Elias had been waiting for what he privately called the big leap, the dramatic moment when everything would change at once. He imagined it like a movie scene, a sudden burst of inspiration, a perfect opportunity, a version of himself transformed overnight into someone disciplined, confident, and unstoppable. This is one of the most quietly damaging myths a person can carry, because it convinces you that small, unimpressive action isn't worth taking. Why write one page today if the real breakthrough is supposed to arrive as a flood? Why exercise for 15 minutes if real transformation is supposed to look dramatic? The myth of the big leap secretly excuses inaction by making small action feel pointless in comparison. But almost nothing meaningful in human history was actually built this way. The empires, the inventions, the careers, the relationships people admire, nearly all of them were constructed from thousands of unremarkable repetitions, most of which were never seen, photographed, or celebrated by anyone. Marcus Aurelius did not become wise in a single dramatic moment of clarity. He became wise by writing private reflections nearly every night for years, slowly refining his thinking one unglamorous entry at a time. The big leap is a story we tell to make our inaction feel like patience, when it is often simply fear wearing a more comfortable disguise. Elias began to realize that he had spent years waiting for permission to begin, when the only permission required had been his own, available the entire time, completely free of charge. The big leap he had been waiting for did not exist as a single moment. It existed, disguised, as the slow accumulation of decisions he had been postponing. The hidden cost of tomorrow. There is a particular kind of math that almost nobody calculates honestly, and it is the math of postponement. Elias, like most people, did not think of, "I'll start tomorrow," as a real decision with real consequences. It felt harmless, even responsible, a small delay, nothing more. But when Tobias asked him to count, honestly, how many tomorrows he had already spent this way, Elias was stunned by the number. Years of tomorrows, stacked one on top of another, had quietly become a decade of unrealized intentions. The postponement had never felt like failure in the moment. It only felt like failure when added up. This is the hidden cost of waiting that almost no one warns you about. A single delayed day costs you almost nothing. But delay is rarely a single event. It is a pattern, and patterns compound, for better or worse, exactly the same way small habits do. The person who writes one page daily for a year has written an entire book by accident. The person who waits for the perfect day to start writing has, after that same year, written nothing at all, despite intending to write the exact same book. The difference between these two people was never talent. It was simply whether the first action happened today or kept being pushed into a tomorrow that never actually arrives, because tomorrow, once it comes, simply becomes another today, with its own excuses ready and waiting. Seneca warned about exactly this trap 2,000 years ago, observing that people guard their money carefully but spend their days recklessly, as though time were the one resource that could never run out. Elias began to understand that every tomorrow he had postponed action toward was not a neutral pause. It was a withdrawal from a finite account, and the account does not send a warning before it empties. If this is landing for you the way it landed for Elias, take a moment now and subscribe to this channel, because we are only halfway through this story, and what comes next is where everything actually begins to change. The workshop floor. Elias decided, after that conversation, to test something. Not a grand plan, not a dramatic life overhaul, just a small, almost embarrassingly modest experiment. He would spend 20 minutes a day, every day, working on the one thing he had always claimed he wanted to do but never started, writing. No pressure to finish anything. No expectation of brilliance. Just 20 minutes, repeated daily, the same unglamorous ritual Tobias had described at his workbench. The first week was humbling. Most of what Elias wrote felt clumsy, forgettable, even embarrassing to reread. The voice in his head that had once whispered tomorrow now whispered something crueler. This isn't working. You clearly don't have what it takes. Real writers don't produce work this rough. This voice is familiar to almost everyone who has ever tried to build something new, and it is precisely the voice that convinces most people to quit before the habit has any chance to compound. Elias nearly listened to it, but he remembered what Tobias had said about the ugly pieces of furniture, the early failures nobody saw, and he kept going anyway, 20 minutes a day, regardless of how rough the result looked. By the second month, something subtle but undeniable had shifted. The writing wasn't necessarily better yet, not dramatically, but the resistance had softened. Sitting down no longer required the same internal battle it once had. The habit itself, separate entirely from talent or inspiration, was becoming the engine. Elias was not relying on motivation anymore, because motivation, he discovered, is an unreliable narrator that shows up inconsistently and abandons you exactly when you need it most. What he was relying on instead was simpler and far more durable. A small, repeated commitment that did not ask how he felt before showing up. Talent without repetition fades. Elias had grown up believing that talent was the rare ingredient separating extraordinary people from ordinary ones. But the longer he watched Tobias's workshop, and the longer he sat with his own daily writing, the more he began to notice something the world rarely advertises. Talent without repetition tends to quietly fade, while modest ability paired with consistency tends to quietly compound, until eventually the second person surpasses the first by a margin that looks, from the outside, like natural gift. Tobias told him about an old friend from his original workshop days, a man with genuinely exceptional natural skill, someone who could shape wood with an instinct Tobias never had. That man, however, only worked when inspiration struck, often disappearing for weeks at a time. Years later, his skill had barely advanced beyond where it started, not because his talent had vanished, but because talent left idle does not grow on its own. Meanwhile, Tobias, with what he considered ordinary ability, had spent thousands of unglamorous hours refining a craft that eventually outpaced his more naturally gifted friend entirely. This pattern repeats endlessly across every field worth naming. The version of you that shows up consistently, even with modest ability, will eventually outperform the version of someone else who possesses extraordinary potential but only acts on it occasionally. This is not an easy truth to accept, because it removes the comfortable excuse that some people are simply born ahead. It replaces that excuse with something more demanding but also more empowering. the outcome is far more available to you than your insecurities have been telling you, provided you are willing to repeat the small action long after the novelty has worn off. The compound interest of small actions. There is a reason financial advisors talk endlessly about compound interest, and there is a reason the same principle applies almost perfectly to habits. A small deposit, repeated consistently, grows slowly at first, almost invisibly, and then accelerates in a way that looks sudden to anyone who was not paying attention from the beginning. Elias's 20 minutes a day looked, for months, like almost nothing. Friends who saw him writing occasionally assumed it was simply a hobby, nothing serious, nothing that would lead anywhere significant. But compound growth does not announce itself early. It works quietly, beneath the surface, until the accumulated effect becomes undeniable. By the end of a full year, Elias had produced far more written work than he had in the previous 5 years combined, despite never once feeling, on any single day, like he was doing something extraordinary. This is the strange and counterintuitive nature of compounding. The daily action almost always feels too small to matter, right up until the moment the accumulated result becomes too large to ignore. The Stoics understood this principle long before modern finance gave it a name. Marcus Aurelius did not become disciplined through one transformative day. He became disciplined through thousands of small, repeated private reflections, none of which felt significant in isolation. The lesson Elias absorbed, slowly and sometimes painfully, was that he had been judging his small actions by the wrong measurement. He kept asking whether today's 20 minutes felt impressive, when the real question was whether today's 20 minutes belonged to a pattern he intended to repeat tomorrow. Impressiveness is the wrong metric for a habit in its early stages. Consistency is the only metric that matters, because consistency is the mechanism that eventually produces the impressive result everyone else only sees after it has already compounded. Identity is built from repetition, not intention. Perhaps the deepest shift in Elias's thinking came when he realized that identity is not built from what you intend to do, but from what you actually repeat. For years, he had told himself and others that he was a writer, in the sense that he wanted to write, thought constantly about writing, and felt a writer's sensitivity to the world. But intention alone never built identity. It was only once the daily 20 minutes became an unbroken pattern that something in him genuinely shifted. Not because the writing had suddenly become brilliant, but because he had become someone who showed up, and that showing up was the actual definition of who he was, regardless of the quality of any single day's output. This distinction matters enormously, because most people measure their identity by their aspirations rather than their patterns. They believe they are disciplined because they want to be disciplined, hardworking because they admire hard work, healthy because they intend to exercise eventually. But the body, the craft, and the character only respond to what is repeated, never to what is merely intended. Tobias put it simply one afternoon in the workshop, sanding a table leg with the same unhurried patience he had practiced for decades. You don't become a craftsman by wanting to be one. You become a craftsman by sanding 10,000 pieces of wood, most of which nobody will ever see or remember. Elias began applying this same logic beyond writing, noticing how it explained nearly every area of his life that had stalled. He had wanted to be fit without consistently moving his body. He had wanted close friendships without consistently reaching out. He had wanted financial stability without consistently managing his money. In every case, the gap was never a lack of desire. It was a lack of repetition, and repetition, unlike talent, was something entirely within his control, available to him the moment he decided to stop waiting for the feeling of readiness and simply began anyway. The workshop years later, several years after that first conversation, Elias returned to Tobias's workshop, this time not as a visitor searching for advice, but as someone who had built his own quiet version of the same discipline. His writing had grown into something real, not because a single dramatic breakthrough had occurred, but because thousands of ordinary 20-minute sessions had slowly accumulated into a body of work he could finally be proud of. Tobias, sanding another table leg with the same patience as before, looked at him and smiled, recognizing something familiar in the way Elias now carried himself. "You don't look like you're waiting for tomorrow anymore," Tobias said. Elias laughed, because it was true, and because he finally understood what his uncle had been trying to teach him all those years earlier. The transformation had never been about discovering hidden talent, finding the perfect moment, or waiting for some external sign of readiness. It had been about a willingness to repeat something small, without applause, without proof that it was working, for far longer than felt comfortable or impressive in the moment. Elias often thinks now about how close he came to never starting at all, How easily another decade could have slipped by under the same comfortable excuse of tomorrow. He thinks about how the only thing standing between his old life and his new one was never a missing talent, but a missing decision, the decision to begin small, repeat it daily, and trust the process long before the process produced anything worth showing anyone else. That decision, more than any single burst of inspiration, was the real turning point of his life. What this story is really asking of you. This story is not really about Elias, or Tobias, or woodworking, or writing. It is about the small action you have been postponing, the one you have told yourself you will begin once conditions improve, once you feel ready, once tomorrow finally arrives in the form you have been imagining. The truth, as uncomfortable as it is that tomorrow rarely arrives as a finished, ready version of itself. It arrives exactly as today did, ordinary and unremarkable, waiting to see whether you will finally treat it as the only day you actually have power over. Talent is real, but it is wildly overrated as the primary driver of meaningful achievement, because talent left dormant accomplishes nothing, while modest ability paired with daily repetition reliably outproduces it over time. The question worth asking yourself tonight is not whether you have enough talent for the life you want. It is whether you are willing to repeat a small, unglamorous action consistently, long after it stops feeling exciting, long before it produces anything impressive enough to show anyone else. Stop waiting for tomorrow. Begin today, with something small enough that you cannot talk yourself out of it, and repeat it tomorrow, and the day after, until the pattern becomes who you are rather than something you merely intended to become. If this story gave you even a small push toward beginning, subscribe to this channel, because this is exactly the kind of message we exist to keep delivering. Stories and lessons built to help you stop waiting and start building the life you have been postponing. Thank you for spending this time with Elias's story. Carry it with you, and let today be the day the postponement finally ends.